I didn't make a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to leave that picture in the background. Whoops, it is getting loose here. Okay. First of all, I wanted to thank everyone for coming again, and Cristina for serving as a discussant. I look forward to everyone's comments and questions. All right, so allow me to begin with a personal story, a personal encounter in the library of the Institute of Brazilian Studies in USP. As a historian, I'm an avid browser of catalogs, and one day I came across the following title, São Paulo de ontem e de hoje, São Paulo of yesterday and today, ... by the way, a casual monograph written by the radio broadcaster Raul Duarte. To my surprise, this livrinho was no memoir. It was an urban history commissioned and freely distributed by Predial Novo Mundo, a real estate development company that was helping to hasten the city's expansion in the 1930s and 40s. According to the book's editor, this trip down memory lane was unusual in 1941. In a city that is tentacular, overwhelming, of the moment, producing each minute new and varied progressive techniques and conquests, it seems as if there remains no time to look back a bit. Yet, by constructing a Whiggish and widely accessible history of the metropolis, Predial Novo Mundo was able to deploy the past to sell the present. In this manner, the São Paulo of ontem only mattered to the extent that it made the São Paulo of hoje even more remarkable, the laudable product of several centuries of blood, sweat, and tears, of destruction and reconstruction. By glancing backward, São Paulo de ontem offered its readers and listeners a confident look forward. As I laid down the book, it occurred to me the irony of doing history in a city that has so often denied its past, or perhaps more accurately in our present day, so often perceives its past as one of constant regeneration. São Paulo's history, São Paulo spaces, seem to have been built on the forward orientation underlying the Predial Novo Mundo's propagandistic piece, an orientation that demands self-destruction. To its critics, the resulting city is a labyrinthine nightmare, the grueling and deeply segregated outcome of opportunistic developers, reckless spenders, and a long line of planning policies without teeth. It is a city not of misplaced but misaligned ideas, characterized by the disjunction between theory and practice, visions and resources. On the other hand, to those such as Simon Romero of the New York Times, who embrace the megalopolis's chaos as the inevitable consequence of unrestricted innovation, São Paulo is, quote, an exhilarating city grasping for solutions to big challenges, where its residents embrace its many pleasures with something approaching abandon. From both perspectives, São Paulo is still in a sense the frontier town that it had always been, wild, unregulated, often violent, and fiercely proud and independent. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I will trace these two perceptions, the positive and the negative, of São Paulo's self-destruction by connecting them to the city's cultural spaces. I will draw on the words of the city's scholars as well as their historical subjects to understand how these men have interpreted São Paulo's history in terms of rupture, linking the city's physical reconfiguration to the reconfiguration of its past, present, and future. In other words, the association of São Paulo with self-destruction is twofold. First, the demolition of its spaces, and second, the erasure of its memory. A space, after all, is a reminder, an object of interpretation for the occupant or passerby. A cultural space is one that is curated. An interpreter, an audience, is assumed, and the creation of meaning within that space is intentional, whether in the form of a performance or a natural history exhibition. Cultural spaces, which I shall restrict to theaters for the purpose of this presentation and my dissertation, can thus shed light on how a city was experienced as well as imagined and hoped to be imagined. As Eloisa has pointed out, theaters are particularly useful access points for interpreting São Paulo because of the relative lack of literature about the city in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Perhaps this is only fitting for a city that in so many other ways has privileged, for better or worse, ephemerality over permanence. For Richard Morse, who will undoubtedly continue to make an appearance over the next day and a half, the city's attempt to break from its past was already evident in the flourishing of Romanticism during the 1840s, and especially in the writings and experiences of Álvarez de Azevedo. It was during this period that the provincial capital began to shed its provincialism, albeit slowly and unsurely. In the words of Morse, São Paulo circa 1850 was already a town constantly groping for rhythms and certainties, its residents, like their successors, eager to deny their history, to neglect their elusive Creole hinterland heritage, and to grasp at ready-made and, in the new context, precarious solutions and ideals from abroad. One example of such a precarious solution was the Teatro São José, the province's attempt at a civic playhouse. Proposed by the impresario Antonio Quachim and funded in conjunction with the province, the São José was justified on the grounds that it would serve as a school of morality, a space that would bring civilization and recognition to the backwater capital. As several legislators argued, if Paris, Rio, and Recife had their government-owned theaters, so should São Paulo. The construction of the São José, however, proved to be a contentious process, beginning with the troubled search for plat and ending with charges of embezzlement on the part of Quachim. The theater, initially inaugurated in 1864, was an unsightly mass of bricks, far from the region's crowning glory that theaters around the world were perceived to be. In 1875, however, Antônio Prado, the planter, industrialist, and future first prefect of São Paulo, took over the Teatro São José's financing and renovation, inaugurating the resurrected theater a year later. This rescue neatly coincided with the city's so-called second founding under the state presidency of João Teodoro Xavier. In the words of Morse, São Paulo of the 1870s fell prey to the Versailles complex, that is, the desire to monumentalize the town's new coffee-induced prosperity in the form of ordered greenery and cobbled and widened streets. In embracing the French model of civilization, Paulistanos rejected, or at least attempted to render less conspicuous, the black shawls of pious women, the rough robes of a scurrying friar, or the ungainly stature of a wandering cow that had populated travelers' accounts in the 1850s and 1860s. The São José's renovation was part of this rebranding, hiding the humiliations of the provincial town behind a freshly painted and pedimented facade. Returning to Morse, then, we can conclude that the impetus behind this precarious solution was to deny history in the sense of dramatically reimagining the city's present and future. But at the same time, it was precisely the precariousness of the São José that prevented it from successfully destroying the past. For Morse, the city's haphazard physical reconfiguration in the 1870s only served to reproduce a cycle of spiritual and physical destruction, spawning a generation of, quote, traditionalists and opportunist urban leaders, the early industrialists who would replace the romanticized rural-urban aristocracy by 1920. The sense of repeated ruptures that runs through Morse's From Community to Metropolis, and for which he has been criticized by several scholars of São Paulo, is perhaps unsurprising given that Morse conducted research for his project in the late 1940s, shortly after São Paulo de Ontem was published. This was the moment at which the urban population surpassed 2 million, the moment at which the industrialized city could be compared to Manchester and Chicago. Yet the assumption of cyclical ruptures from the past was already commonly imagined and articulated in several ways by Paulistanos much earlier, around the turn of the 20th century. First, some residents, especially those born and raised in the city, renounced the region's identity as a frontier town, a, quote, burg of law students and beatas, seeking instead to establish São Paulo's reputation as Brazil's second city, as well as distinguish the modernizing state capital from its surroundings. Conscious of the city's projected character, youths like the caricature of Juvenal in José Agudo's Gente Rica, published in 1912, encouraged their elders to disown the past, including the iconic Bandeirante, whom Juvenal dismissed as a robber and antiquated mascot. Others took a less active approach in framing the destruction of a former São Paulo through the observation of the city's swift development. The State Sanitation Committee's 1891 report, for example, remarked that, quote, although founded over 330 years ago, São Paulo is a new city whose general appearance is now marked by constant renovation of old buildings, which vanish rapidly, and by the numerous structures that make up the new districts. While the report largely condemned the city's metamorphosis due to its lack of planning, many legislators at the same time celebrated the birth of the modern city. In the State Chamber of Deputies, Miranda Azevedo marveled at the new neighborhoods that sprouted every month, and Eugenio Egas, to much applause, praised the capital that had in a decade transformed from, quote, a tiny city into one of the great capitals of Brazil. The establishment of feeders paralleled this rapid metamorphosis. While São Paulo in 1895 could only boast of 3 theaters, 2 of which would soon be destroyed, by 1914, over 150 additional theaters had opened their doors. Many of these spaces were simply furnished and decorated, and some lacked permanent stages. At first, most hosted variety shows and fundraising soirees for working-class audiences, but a vast majority founded after 1906 were primarily cinemas. São Paulo's theater boom did little to expunge the city of its frontier town past. Like any rush, this theater rush was fueled by individual initiative, short-lived get-rich-quick schemes, and general lack of oversight. Unsurprisingly, by the 1920s, members of the municipal chamber resorted to a more ambiguous adjective for describing São Paulo's death and rebirth, vertiginous, inducing nausea or giddiness, depending on one's point of view. As Nikolaus Savchenko and others have argued, it was in part this vertiginous self-destruction and reproduction, the vortex of revolutionary potentials, to quote Savchenko, that inspired the cannibalism of Paulistano modernism. To begin with, modernism in itself was an inherently lethal ideal. The continual aspiration to make it new, as Ezra Pound decreed, inevitably demanded the death of the old. In this sense, the birth of Brazilian modernism in São Paulo served to further perpetuate the city's reputation of self-destruction. The anthropophagia of the late 1920s, however, added another dimension to the impulse for aesthetic change. The image of not only killing, but also swallowing and digesting the old, and in particular, the old world. The inspiration for São Paulo's latest reincarnation, then, would lie not in the Beaux-Arts columns and equally disciplined manners of an imagined Europe, but rather in the wild tupi, the green palms and yellow fruits of an idyllic Brazil. This was a reversal of Morse's characterization of 1850 São Paulo. Paulistano modernists were not denying their history, they were wholeheartedly embracing it, or at least the distant past, that which preceded the colonial legacy. As in São Paulo de ontem, the past was summoned to break with the present and herald a new era. Moreover, the continual repetition of that break was celebrated. Precarious solutions and ideas were far from undesirable. It was precisely their ephemerality and unpredictability that made them enticing. Ephemerality was not only a modernist ideal, however. It was the fate of most cultural spaces inaugurated in the city between the 1910s and 1920s. How many theaters still stand from that era? 2 were preserved by the municipality and state, respectively, the Teatro Municipal, as Sarah noted, and the more modest Teatro São Pedro in Barra Funda. Not trivial to their survival was the fact that both were designed by Ramos de Azevedo and his associates, a very prestigious firm, as Cristina studied. Most theaters, however, have long disappeared, the victims of São Paulo's rapid urbanization, as well as the lack of enforcement of legislation intended to prevent fires and ensure the structure's safety. At least as early as 1894, the state sought to regulate public buildings' hygiene, safety, and comfort, a trio of terms that would make a regular appearance in both state and municipal legislation over the coming decades. As well-documented inspections indicate, however, many theaters failed to comply with such standards, especially since a large number were housed in buildings not originally intended for crowds or flammable film. Even the municipally owned Colombo and São Paulo theaters, for example, had begun as a public market and meat warehouse, respectively. They ended as a pile of ashes and a highway. As Silvana Rubino and other scholars of preservation in Brazil have shown, for most of the past century, no level of government made much effort to preserve São Paulo's more recent urban heritage. This is in stark contrast to where we stand today, Chicago, also a second city, where national landmarks from the turn of the 20th century abound. True, Chicago was the birthplace of the skyscraper, and certainly São Paulo's self-destructive tendencies have not been unique. Most cities have at one point or another been accused of denying the past and failing to make spatial sense of the present. To some extent, these are the growing pains of an urban center. However, if São Paulo is still a teenager, then it has been a long adolescence. Perhaps then, even as São Paulo begins to memorialize and revitalize its cultural spaces, the identity of the self-destructive city, for good or bad, will hold, an identity ironically built on a history of the erasure of history. Thank you.